Imagine the sky over London in late 1944. It is not filled with the familiar droning hum of hundreds of Heinkel bombers, nor the rattling pulse jet of the V-1 flying bomb. Instead, there is only a silent supersonic streak plunging from the stratosphere at 3,000 miles per hour. A V-2 rocket strikes the heart of the city. But this time, the explosion does not level a city block. It vaporizes 3 square miles as a blind flash of light, hotter than the surface of the sun, followed by a shock wave that shatters glass from Westminster to the coast of France. The mushroom cloud rises 60,000 feet into the English sky, casting a radioactive shadow over the entire Allied war effort. This is the ultimate nightmare scenario of the Second World War. What if the Third Reich had won the race to build the atomic bomb? Today, we are tearing up the history books to conduct a deep analytical war game on the darkest alternate timeline of the 20th century. We will examine the industrial logistics, the raw physics, and the terrifying delivery systems that could have turned this hypothetical terror into a battlefield reality. If you want to survive this theoretical fallout and join a community that takes military history seriously, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and lock in. We analyze the tactics, the hardware, and the brutal realities of warfare past, present, and alternate. To understand how close the world came to this abyss, we have to rewind the clock long before the first shots were fired in Poland. We have to look at the strategic context and the raw intellectual capital of the 1920s and 1930s. Before the rise of the current regime in Germany, the Weimar Republic was effectively the Silicon Valley of quantum mechanics and nuclear physics. Göttingen and Berlin were the epicenters of the atomic universe. You had minds like Max Planck, Werner Heisenberg, and Otto Hahn rewriting the fundamental laws of nature. In December 1938, at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann achieved the impossible. They bombarded uranium with neutrons and discovered barium as a byproduct, proving that the uranium atom had been split. Nuclear fission was no longer a blackboard theory. It was a hard physical reality. The energy release calculated from this reaction was staggering, millions of times more powerful than any conventional chemical explosive like TNT. The German military apparatus, specifically the Army Ordnance Office, caught wind of this very quickly. By April 1939, months before the invasion of Poland, the first Uranverein, or Uranium Club, was formed. They were already looking into the military applications of nuclear fission, while the United States military was still trying to figure out how to transition its cavalry from horses to tanks. So, how does a nation with a head start, the best physicists in the world, and access to the necessary raw materials, fumble the ball on the 1-yard line? To build an alternate timeline where Germany succeeds, we have to fix their historical, logistical, and bureaucratic failures. In reality, the German nuclear program was a decentralized, underfunded mess. It was split among competing agencies. The post office even had its own nuclear research division at one point, which sounds like a bad joke, but it highlights the catastrophic lack of unified command. Compare this to the American Manhattan Project. General Leslie Groves ran the Manhattan Project with the ruthless efficiency of a military dictator. He commanded a budget of $2 billion, employed 130,000 workers, and built secret cities in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, that consumed 10% of the entire electrical grid of the United States. The historical German project was given the equivalent of a few $1 million and a handful of drafted scientists working in scattered laboratories. But what if Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, had recognized the true potential of the bomb in 1940, right after the fall of France? What if, instead of pouring billions of Reichsmarks into the V-2 rocket program, a program that historically cost more than the Manhattan Project, but delivered less high explosive than a single conventional bombing raid, Speer had consolidated those resources under one supreme nuclear directive? Let us look at the raw materials and the industrial logistics required to make this happen in our modified timeline. To build a bomb, you need fissile material, specifically uranium-235 or plutonium-239. Natural uranium is overwhelmingly composed of the stable isotope U-238. Only about 0.7% is the highly unstable fissionable U-235. You have to separate them, a process that requires massive industrial infrastructure. Germany had access to uranium ore from the Joachimsthal mines in occupied Czechoslovakia. When they conquered Belgium in 1940, they also captured thousands of tons of uranium ore from the Belgian Congo stockpile in Olen. So the raw uranium was there. The bottleneck was the moderator. To create a controlled chain reaction in a nuclear reactor, which you need to produce plutonium, you have to slow down the neutrons. The Americans used highly purified graphite. The Germans, due to a calculation error by physicist Walther Bothe regarding the neutron absorption of industrial graphite, concluded that graphite would not work. They pivoted entirely to heavy water or deuterium oxide. Heavy water is incredibly rare in nature. The only place in the world producing it in industrial quantities in 1940 was the Norsk hydro plant at Vemork, perched on a frozen, inaccessible cliffside in occupied Norway. In our alternate timeline, the defense of this heavy water plant becomes the highest strategic priority of the Wehrmacht. Historically, Norwegian commandos trained by the British Special Operations Executive managed to infiltrate the plant in 1943 and blow up the heavy water cells in a daring raid. It was a masterpiece of unconventional warfare. But what if the Germans had fortified Vemork like they fortified the Atlantic Wall? Imagine a perimeter secured by a full regiment of SS mountain troops, ringed with flak towers mounting 88mm anti-aircraft guns, and protected by dedicated Luftwaffe fighter squadrons flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s out of nearby airfields. If the British sabotage attempts fail and the heavy water flows uninterrupted into Germany, Werner Heisenberg gets his working nuclear reactor by 1942. Once you have a working reactor, you can breed plutonium-2I99. Plutonium is much easier to chemically separate from the spent uranium fuel than trying to mechanically enrich U-235 using thousands of centrifuges. This is the shortcut. This is how Germany gets the bomb by early 1944. Now we must analyze the force comparison and the delivery systems. Having a nuclear core is useless if you cannot deliver it to the target. The first American atomic bombs were massive. Little Boy, the gun-type uranium bomb dropped on Hiroshima, weighed 9,700 pounds. Fat Man, the implosion-type plutonium bomb dropped on Nagasaki, weighed over 10,000 pounds and was 5 feet in diameter. You cannot strap a 10,000-pound physics package to a standard medium bomber and expect it to cross the English Channel, let alone the Atlantic Ocean. The Luftwaffe's heavy bomber program, the Ural Bomber Project championed by General Walther Wever in the 1930s, had been largely abandoned after his death in a plane crash. The German air doctrine was entirely focused on tactical support for the Blitzkrieg. Dive bombers like the Stuka and medium bombers like the Heinkel He 111 were designed to act as flying artillery, softening up frontline targets for the Panzer divisions. They were not designed for strategic, deep penetration bombing of industrial centers. This tactical myopia was a fatal flaw. It is reminiscent of the Confederate Army during the American Civil War. The South possessed brilliant tactical commanders like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson who could win localized battles with aggressive maneuvers, but they completely lacked the strategic industrial base and the long-range logistical vision of Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, who understood that modern war is won by destroying the enemy's capacity to make war. If Germany develops the atomic bomb, they must undergo a radical shift in military doctrine overnight. They need a delivery system capable of carrying a 5-ton payload over thousands of miles. Enter the America Bomber Project. Historically, this a desperate late-war design competition to build a transatlantic bomber capable of striking New York City from bases in France or the Azores. The most promising candidate was the Messerschmitt Me 264. This aircraft was a technological marvel, featuring a sleek cigar-shaped fuselage and a massive wingspan designed for extreme range. Powered by 4 BMW 801 radial engines, the same engines used in the Focke-Wulf Fw 190 fighter, the Me-264 had a theoretical range of over 9,000 miles. However, carrying a 10,000-pound atomic weapon would severely degrade its performance. The aircraft would be sluggish, climbing slowly into the freezing, unpressurized altitudes of 26,000 feet, where the outside temperature drops to -50 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew would rely on oxygen masks and heavy electrically heated flight suits to survive the grueling 15-hour flight to the American East Coast. But what if they targeted London or Moscow instead? For this, the delivery system becomes much more terrifying. We have to look at the V-2 rocket, the A-4 ballistic missile designed by Werner von Braun at Peenemünde. The V-2 was 46 feet tall, weighed 27,000 pounds, fully fueled with a highly volatile mixture of liquid oxygen and ethanol, and could reach the edge of space before plunging down on its target at Mach 4. There was no defense against it in 1944. Anti-aircraft guns could not track it, and fighter planes could not catch it. It was the ultimate terror weapon. However, the standard payload of a V-2 was only a 2,200-pound Amatol warhead. The nose cone was simply not large enough, and the thrust of the rocket motor was not powerful to lift a 10,000-pound early-generation atomic bomb. The physics of miniaturizing a nuclear weapon to fit inside a V-2 nose cone took the United States and the Soviet Union over a decade of post-war research to achieve. Could the German scientists have designed a smaller, more efficient weapon? Perhaps a crude gun-type device utilizing highly enriched uranium, similar to Little Boy, but scaled down. It is highly unlikely they could have shaved 8,000 pounds off the design without compromising the critical mass required for detonation. Therefore, the ballistic missile delivery of a German atomic bomb in 1944 is a logistical impossibility. They would have to rely on aircraft. And this changes the entire defensive posture of the Allied air forces. Imagine the intelligence reports reaching London and Washington. The Enigma intercepts reveal a massive, heavily guarded facility in the Bavarian Alps or the Harz Mountains. Reconnaissance flights from modified Spitfires flying at 40,000 feet bring back photographs of strange, heavily shielded bunkers and elongated runways being constructed specifically for heavy four-engine aircraft. The realization sets in that the Germans are preparing to drop a weapon of unimaginable destructive power. How does this alter the strategic bombing campaign of the United States Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force? Historically, the Allies pounded German ball-bearing factories, oil refineries, and rail yards to grind the Nazi war machine to a halt. In our alternate timeline, every single B-17 Flying Fortress, B-24 Liberator, and Avro Lancaster is redirected to a single, desperate mission: the suppression and destruction of the German nuclear infrastructure. It would become a bloodbath in the skies over Europe. The Luftwaffe, armed with advanced radar-guided flak batteries and newly introduced Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters, would fiercely defend these nuclear sites. The American 8th Air Force would suffer casualty rates that would make the disastrous raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg look like a training exercise. We are talking about losing 100 heavy bombers in a single afternoon. The skies would be filled with burning aluminum and silk parachutes. And what about the Eastern Front? How does a German atomic bomb affect the brutal, grinding war of attrition against the Soviet Union? By late 1943 and early 1944, the Red Army was an unstoppable juggernaut. Following the German defeat at Stalingrad and the massive armored clash at Kursk, the Soviets were pushing the Wehrmacht back across the steppes of Ukraine and Belarus. The Soviet operational art, utilizing deep battle doctrine, relied on massive concentrations of artillery, armor, and infantry to punch through German defensive lines and exploit the rear areas. Millions of men and tens of thousands of T-34 tanks were rolling westward. A single atomic bomb dropped on a major Soviet staging area could instantly vaporize an entire shock army. Imagine the psychological impact on the Soviet high command. Stalin, who was historically deeply paranoid and demanding of his generals, would be faced with a weapon that could wipe out his numerical superiority in a fraction of a second. Would an atomic strike on a Soviet troop concentration halt the Red Army? We have to look at historical precedents of wonder weapons altering the battlefield. During the First World War, the introduction of poison gas by the Germans at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915 caused massive panic and opened a miles-wide gap in the Allied lines. It was a terrifying new technology that completely changed the tactical landscape. However, the Germans lacked the strategic reserves to exploit the breakthrough, and the Allies quickly developed countermeasures like gas masks. The wonder weapon caused horrific casualties but did not win the war. An atomic bomb is exponentially more destructive than chlorine gas, but the principle remains. A weapon is only as effective as the military doctrine and the logistical tale that supports it. If Germany drops one atomic bomb on the Eastern Front, destroying a Soviet army group, the blast radius is still only a few miles wide. The Eastern Front was over 1,000 miles long. The Soviet Union had millions of men in reserve. Unless Germany possessed an assembly line capable of churning out dozens of atomic bombs a month, a single detonation would be a localized tactical victory, not a strategic war-winning blow. It would, however, enrage the Soviets to a level of barbarism unseen in human history. The retaliation against German prisoners of war and civilians would be absolute and merciless. We must also consider the political and command structure of the Third Reich. Hitler was notoriously distrustful of physics, often dismissing it as abstract theoretical nonsense compared to the tangible kinetic power of massive tanks and artillery pieces. He favored the colossal, the visible. This is why he approved the construction of the Panzer VIII Maus, a 188-ton super-heavy tank that was entirely useless on a muddy battlefield because it would sink into the earth and collapse any bridge it tried to cross. It is easy to play Monday morning quarterback with history, but the German High Command consistently prioritized tactical, frontline weapons over long-term strategic projects. For the German nuclear program to succeed, we have to assume a massive shift in Hitler's psychology, or we have to assume that someone like Albert Speer managed to hide the true scale of the project from the Führer until a working prototype was ready to be demonstrated. Let us assume the prototype is ready. The scientists at the Haigerloch Research Facility, operating in a cave beneath a castle to avoid Allied bombing, have successfully assembled a working uranium core. The metallurgy is complete. The explosive lenses required to compress the core into criticality have been machined to micromillimeter tolerances by the finest engineers at Krupp. The weapon is loaded onto a heavily modified Heinkel He-177 Grafe heavy bomber. The He-177 was a deeply flawed aircraft, prone to engine fires because the designers tried to couple two engines together in a single nacelle to reduce drag. But for this mission, the mechanics have stripped it down, reinforced the bomb bay, and tuned the engines to perfection. The target is not a city. The target is a demonstration. They plan to drop it over the North Sea, inviting neutral observers from Sweden and Switzerland to witness the detonation, hoping the sheer terror of the flash will force the Allies to the negotiating table. Why would they choose a demonstration instead of a decapitation strike on London? Because by late 1944, the Allied armies are already on the borders of the Reich. The D-Day landings have succeeded. Paris is liberated. The Red Army is in Poland. Dropping the bomb on London might kill 100,000 civilians, but it would not destroy the millions of Allied soldiers already marching on Berlin. The German High Command knows they cannot win a conventional war of attrition. The bomb is their only bargaining chip for a conditional surrender. They want to hold the world hostage. The bomber takes off in the dead of night, escorted by a squadron of Focke-Wulf Fw 152 high-altitude interceptors to fend off any British night fighters. The bomb is armed. The countdown begins. The entire world holds its breath as the aircraft reaches the drop zone. But having the bomb and having the tactical doctrine to deploy it effectively in a collapsing theater of war are two entirely different beasts, and the decisions made in the next 24 hours will determine if Europe is reduced to radioactive ash or if the Allied war machine can adapt to the atomic age under fire. The bomb bay doors of the modified Heinkel He-177 snap open. The 10,000-pound device, a terrifying culmination of stolen time and redirected resources, plunges into the freezing slipstream over the North Sea. Inside the heavy steel casing, a primitive radar altimeter, reverse-engineered from captured British H-2S bomber radar, pings the turbulent gray water below. At exactly 1,800 feet, the firing circuit closes. 32 explosive lenses, machined to microscopic tolerances and arranged in a perfect sphere around a subcritical plutonium core, detonate simultaneously. The implosion wave travels inward at roughly 26,000 feet per second, compressing the heavy metal to twice its normal density. The polonium-beryllium initiator at the dead center crushes under the immense pressure, releasing a sudden, massive flood of neutrons. criticality is achieved. A sphere of plasma hotter than the core of the sun violently expands. The thermal pulse vaporizes the low-hanging winter clouds instantly. On the coast of Scotland, early morning radar patrols and coastal defense batteries report a blinding false sunrise. Seismographs in London, highly calibrated to detect the heavy earth-shaking thud of V-2 rockets hitting the city, snap their delicate needles right off the recording drums. The sheer overpressure wave rolls across the water, creating a localized tsunami that batters the coastlines of neutral Sweden and occupied Denmark. The demonstration is a technical triumph, but tactically, it does not trigger the political collapse the German High Command had banked on. Instead of suing for a conditional peace, the Allied High Command goes into a state of absolute cold-blooded mobilization. Eisenhower, Churchill, and Roosevelt realize instantly that this is no longer a war of liberation. It is a zero-sum game of species survival. But the German High Command knows the demonstration was just the opening gambit. Their intelligence networks, fed by desperate reconnaissance flights, show that the Allied armies are not halting. So the order is given to deploy the remaining operational corps. They do not have a stockpile of hundreds. They have exactly 2 bombs left. How do you deploy an arsenal of 2 weapons to stop a multi-front war involving millions of men? You cannot hit Washington. You cannot hit the industrial heartland of the Urals. You must sever the jugular vein of the enemy's immediate operational capability. For the Western Front, the target is obvious: the port of Antwerp. We have to look at the historical precedent of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The entire objective of Hitler's massive, desperate armored thrust through the Ardennes forest was to capture Antwerp, split the British and American armies, and choke off their supply lines. It cost the Germans tens of thousands of men, thousands of armored vehicles, and their very last strategic panzer reserves to fail at this objective. In our alternate timeline with an atomic weapon, they do not need to punch through the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. They just need one heavy bomber to slip through the Allied radar net. The delivery system for this strike cannot be the fragile Heinkel He 177. They need altitude, payload capacity, and range. They turn to the Junkers Ju 390, a massive 6-engine Leviathan originally designed for the America Bomber project. It has a wingspan of over 165 feet and can carry a payload exceeding 22,000 pounds. To get it past the dense overlapping fields of Allied anti-aircraft fire and fighter patrols, German engineers stripped the aircraft of all defensive armament. They removed the heavy dorsal turrets, the waist guns, and thousands of pounds of steel armor plating. Every single ounce of weight saved translates to extra altitude. December 16, 1944. 0300 hours. The temperature is a biting 8 degrees Fahrenheit. A heavy, blinding winter fog blankets the English Channel and the Low Countries, grounding the vast majority of Allied fighter patrols. This is the exact meteorological window the Luftwaffe has been praying for. At a heavily camouflaged, extended concrete runway in Bavaria, the stripped-down Ju 389 lumbers forward. Its 6 BMW radial engines scream at maximum manifold pressure, burning specialized high-octane aviation fuel. It takes every inch of the 2-mile strip to get the heavily laden beast airborne, its landing gear retracting just feet above the tree line. By 0530 hours, the bomber crosses the coastline of occupied Holland at a staggering altitude of 32,000 feet. The crew is breathing bottled oxygen, huddled in electrically heated flight suits, operating in near silence. At 0600 hours, British chain-home radar operators pick up a single large blip. They classify it as a stray reconnaissance plane, perhaps a high-altitude Arado R-234 jet. Standard intercept protocols are initiated, but climbing to 32,000 feet takes an American P-50 Mustang over 15 minutes of full-throttle ascent. By the time the American interceptors are clawing their way through the freezing troposphere, fighting engine stalls in the thin air, the Ju 390 is already on its bomb run. How do you defend against a threat you cannot even categorize? The Allied fighter pilots were trained to look for massive box formations of hundreds of enemy bombers, not a single silent harbinger of doom flying in the stratosphere. At 0614 hours, the German bombardier aligns the crosshairs of his advanced bomb sight on the sprawling, densely packed docks of Antwerp. The 10,000-pound weapon is released. The Ju-390 immediately banks into a steep diving turn, pushing its airframe to the absolute structural limit to escape the impending blast radius. At 0616 hours, the bomb detonates at an altitude of 2,000 feet. The port of Antwerp is packed shoulder to shoulder with Liberty ships offloading thousands of tons of artillery ammunition, aviation fuel, and rations. The atomic blast wave, moving exponentially faster than the speed of sound, hits the harbor. It is a cascading apocalyptic catastrophe. The initial thermal radiation, burning at millions of degrees, instantly ignites the exposed fuel depots and the decks of the cargo ships. Then the overpressure wave, packing thousands of pounds of force per square inch, crushes the steel hulls of the Liberty ships like in empty tin cans. The water in the harbor is instantly pressed down into a massive depression before rebounding into a tidal wave of boiling, irradiated sludge. But the atomic blast is only the trigger. The secondary explosions of thousands of tons of artillery shells, high explosives, and white phosphorus stored on the docks dwarf the initial nuclear yield. We must look at the Halifax explosion of 1917, where a French cargo ship loaded with wartime explosives collided in the harbor, leveling the entire Canadian city in a blast equivalent to nearly 3 kilotons of TNT. Now multiply that destructive force by a factor of 10 and add a lethal, invisible dose of gamma radiation. The entire logistical backbone of the American and British armies in West Europe is severed in a fraction of a second. The famed Red Ball Express, the massive, relentless convoy system of thousands of GMC trucks keeping General George S. Patton's Third Army moving, suddenly has absolutely nothing to haul. M4 Sherman tanks run out of gas in the fields of France. Artillery batteries are reduced to strictly rationing shells. The unstoppable Allied advance hits a brick wall of logistical starvation. While the West burns, the Third Reich is still fighting a two-front war, and the Eastern Front is collapsing at a terrifying speed. The third and final bomb in their limited arsenal is loaded onto a modified Focke-Wulf Fw 200 Condor. The target is the Sandomierz bridgehead on the Vistula River. By January 1945, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front has amassed millions of men, thousands of T-34 tanks, and a staggering concentration of heavy artillery in this specific bridgehead, preparing for the final massive thrust toward Berlin. The density of Soviet troops packed into this staging area is unparalleled in military history. It is a target-rich environment that simply cannot be ignored. The Condor approaches at low altitude, utilizing the cover of a massive blinding blizzard that has grounded the Soviet Air Force. They drop the bomb via specialized parachute system to give the slow-moving aircraft enough time to escape the thermal flash. The detonation over the frozen Vistula River creates a horrifying new environmental phenomenon. The intense heat instantly vaporizes the thick river ice and the deep snowpack, while the blast wave creates a crater hundreds of feet deep into the frozen earth. Millions of gallons of water are vaporized, heavily irradiated by the plutonium core, and then fall back to the earth as a steaming, highly radioactive black rain. What happens to a mechanized armored division when the very earth it drives on becomes a lethal weapon? The Soviet T-34 tank is a rugged, brutal, and highly effective machine. Its sloped armor was designed to deflect the lethal 88mm armor-piercing shells of a German Tiger tank. But heavy steel armor offers minimal protection against prompt gamma and neutron radiation. The physical blast wave might flip the lighter vehicles and strip the riding infantry from the backs of the armor, but the real killer on this battlefield is completely invisible. Soviet tank crews surviving the initial shockwave 3 or 4 miles from ground zero would continue their aggressive advance, completely unaware that they had just absorbed a fatal dose of ionizing radiation. Within 48 hours, the vomiting, the internal bleeding, and the total central nervous system collapse would begin to paralyze the armored spearhead. How does the Red Army command structure react to this unprecedented weapon? Do they halt the advance? Historically, Soviet military doctrine under Joseph Stalin did not flinch at massive, catastrophic casualties. Commanders like Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev would not view the atomic bomb as a reason to surrender or retreat. They would view it as a massive, localized, and highly effective artillery strike. the overarching strategic orders from Moscow would remain unchanged. Advance at all costs. Soviet penal battalions and fresh conscript armies would be ordered to march directly through the irradiated wasteland of the Vistula bridgehead. They would be marching straight into a silent death zone without Geiger counters, without dosimeters, and without any protective chemical gear, breathing in highly radioactive dust kicked up by the tank treads and artillery barrages. Imagine the sheer hellscape of this alternate Eastern Front. The ambient temperature is 20 below 0 Fahrenheit. The ground is a treacherous mixture of deep frozen mud and radioactive glass. Soviet field medics and frontline surgeons are completely baffled by the sudden, horrific symptoms of acute radiation sickness, likely misdiagnosing it en masse as a virulent new strain of dysentery, typhus, or a German biological weapon. The command structure of an entire Soviet shock army dissolves, not from kinetic enemy fire but from cellular destruction from within. The German atomic gambit has achieved the unthinkable. They have decapitated the primary Allied logistical lifeline in the West, and they have vaporized the immediate spearhead of the Soviet juggernaut in the East. They have bought themselves precious time. But time is a luxury that only matters if you have the industrial capacity to exploit it, and the Allied war machine, though bleeding, disoriented, and horrified, is far from dead. The sleeping giant has been burned, and the strategic bomber commands of the United States and Great Britain are about to unleash a retaliation so ferocious, it will make the atomic flashes look like a mere prelude to the true apocalypse. The immediate shockwave of the Antwerp and Vistula detonations does not just shatter glass and vaporize steel, it instantly obliterates centuries of established military doctrine. In the war rooms of Washington and London, the realization sets in that the fundamental geometry of warfare has been violently rewritten overnight. How do you command a mechanized army when massing your forces for an offensive guarantees their sudden radioactive annihilation? For thousands of years, from the Roman legions to the Union Army at Gettysburg, the core principle of military strategy was concentration of force. If General Robert E. Lee had possessed a tactical nuclear weapon in 1863, General George Meade's densely packed offensive lines on Cemetery Ridge would have been erased in a millisecond, rendering the Union's numerical superiority entirely irrelevant. The Allied High Command now faces this exact nightmare on a continental scale. The era of the grand, sweeping armored thrust, characterized by hundreds of Sherman tanks and thousands of infantrymen advancing shoulder to shoulder, is dead. To survive this new atomic battlefield, the United States Army and the British military must instantly adopt a doctrine of radical dispersal. Divisions can no longer bivouac in massive sprawling tent cities. Armor must be scattered across miles of French and Belgian countryside, hidden in tree lines and ravines, only converging at the absolute last possible moment to strike a target before immediately scattering again. This creates a logistical nightmare of unprecedented proportions. Supplying a concentrated army is difficult. Supplying a highly dispersed, constantly moving force of 2 million men is a mathematical, agonizing puzzle. With the port of Antwerp reduced to a glowing, irradiated crater, the logistical bottleneck comes the single greatest threat to the survival of the Allied forces in Europe. The famed Red Ball Express, which historically relied on a relatively linear route from the Normandy beaches to the front lines, is now completely severed. How does the American war machine adapt to the sudden amputation of its primary logistical artery? They do what the American industrial base does best. They brute force the problem with overwhelming mechanical output. The deep water ports of Cherbourg and Marseille, hundreds of miles further away from the front lines, are pushed beyond their absolute theoretical limits. The United States Army Air Forces undergo a massive doctrinal shift, essentially foreshadowing the Berlin airlift years before the Cold War begins. Thousands of C-47 Skytrain and C-54 Skymaster transport planes are diverted from every other theater of war, flying 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in highly dispersed flight paths to avoid presenting a single lucrative target to a German atomic intercept. They are flying in aviation fuel, artillery shells, and plasma, quite literally dropping the lifeblood of the army from the sky. It is a wildly inefficient, incredibly dangerous method of supply, but it is the only way to keep the armored spearheads from starving to death in the snow. Simultaneously, an intelligence war of unparalleled desperation erupts in the shadows. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, under the command of Wild Bill Donovan, alongside the British Special Operations Executive, shifts entirely from sabotage and partisan training to a single fanatical objective. They must find the remaining German nuclear infrastructure. This is no longer a matter of bombing ball-bearing factories. This is a hunt for the most dangerous facilities on the planet. We can compare this desperate intelligence scramble to the frantic search for mobile Scud missile launchers during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, but with the stakes magnified to the survival of entire nations. The Allies know the Germans do not have a massive, centralized facility like Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The German program is decentralized, hidden in caves, salt mines, and subterranean bunkers deep within the Bavarian Alps or the Harz Mountains. To find these needles in a continental haystack, the Allies unleash a tidal wave of aerial reconnaissance. Specially modified P-38 Lightnings and British de Havilland Mosquitoes, stripped of all armor and weapons to maximize speed and altitude, crisscross the airspace over the Reich. They are not dropping bombs. They are taking millions of high-resolution photographs looking for newly poured concrete, heavily defended power lines leading into mountainsides, or the subtle thermal signatures of underground reactors venting heat into the freezing winter air. When a suspected site is identified, the response is not a standard bombing raid. The Allies begin utilizing Operation Aphrodite, a highly experimental and incredibly dangerous program where war-weary B-17 flying fortresses are stripped down, packed with 30,000 pounds of Torpex high explosive, and flown via primitive radio control directly into heavily fortified bunker complexes. It is a brute force, kinetic decapitation strike, utilizing the heaviest conventional ordnance available to crack the earth open and bury the German atomic scientists alive. But what happens when the ultimate weapon of terror meets the ultimate engine of industrial mass production? While Germany is desperately trying to scrape together enough fissile material for a third or fourth bomb, the American Manhattan Project is reaching its terrifying climax. General Leslie Groves, operating with a budget that rivals the gross domestic product of small nations, accelerates the production of plutonium-239 at Hanford and highly enriched uranium-235 at Oak Ridge. The Trinity test in the New Mexico desert is pushed forward, its success validating the implosion design. The historical timeline is fractured. The target for the first American atomic weapons is no longer the Japanese home islands. It is the absolute, total eradication of the Third Reich. The delivery system requires a massive logistical pivot. The B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced, expensive, and complex aircraft of the Second World War, was designed specifically for the vast distances of the Pacific Theater. It boasts a pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, a top speed of over 350 miles per hour, and the capability to carry a 20,000-pound payload at an altitude of 31,000 feet. The United States Army Air Forces immediately begin transferring the specialized Silverplate B-29 squadrons, specifically modified to carry nuclear weapons, from the Marianas to heavily fortified airbases in East Anglia, England. The runways in Britain must be frantically lengthened and reinforced with millions of tons of concrete to handle the massive 120,000-pound takeoff weight of the superfortresses. The geopolitical and political ramifications of this atomic standoff are staggering. At the Yalta Conference, the dynamic between Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin is fundamentally altered. The Soviet Union has just lost an entire shock army to a German nuclear strike on the Vistula River. Stalin's paranoia, already legendary, reaches a boiling point. He demands that the Americans and British immediately share their atomic secrets, viewing their hesitation as a direct betrayal. The seeds of the Cold War, historically planted in the ashes of 1945, sprout instantly and violently in the winter of 1944. The concept of mutually assured destruction, a doctrine that would define global geopolitics for the next half-century, arrives a decade early, but it is deeply asymmetrical. Germany has a handful of crude, unreliable devices. The United States is about to open an industrial assembly line of apocalyptic destruction. When the American retaliation finally comes, it is a masterclass in strategic overkill. The target is not a demonstration over the ocean, nor is it a tactical strike on a troop concentration. The target is Berlin. The B-29 superfortress, flying higher and faster than the lumbering German Ju-390, easily penetrates the depleted Luftwaffe air defenses. The drop of the Little Boy uranium gun-type weapon, yielding approximately 15 kilotons of explosive force, vaporizes the Chancellery, the Reichstag, and the entire command structure of the Nazi regime in a single blinding flash. The heart of the Third Reich is instantly transformed into a sea of radioactive glass. But the American atomic campaign does not stop there. Fat Man plutonium devices are systematically dropped on the remaining industrial centers of the Ruhr Valley, the submarine pens at Kiel, and the suspected nuclear research facilities in Bavaria. The United States does not just defeat Germany, they systematically erase its industrial capacity from the face of the earth. This dark alternate history forces us to confront a brutal, uncompromising truth about the nature of modern warfare. A technological wonder weapon, no matter how devastating, cannot overcome a massive, insurmountable deficit in industrial capacity and logistical depth. The German atomic bomb in this scenario was a terrifying tactical speed bump, a weapon of unparalleled cruelty that inflicted horrific casualties. But it was fundamentally incapable of reversing the strategic tide of a multi-front war against the combined industrial might of the United States and the Soviet Union. It did not save the Third Reich. It merely ensured that their inevitable defeat was accompanied by the radioactive annihilation of their own homeland, turning the European continent into a poisoned, scarred wasteland that would take centuries to heal. We study these darkest timelines not to glorify the destruction, but to understand the terrifying razor's edge upon which our own history balanced. The logistics of survival are written in the margins of these hypothetical battle plans, proving that the true victor in a global conflict is rarely the one who invents the most terrifying weapon, but the one who can mass produce, deliver, and sustain the war effort long after the initial shockwave has faded. Now I want to hear from you in the comments below. If the United States had to divert its B-29 fleet to Europe to counter a German atomic threat, how would this have changed the outcome of the Pacific War against Japan? Option A, the U.S. would rely entirely on a bloody conventional amphibious invasion of the Japanese home islands, resulting in millions of casualties. Option B, the Soviet Union would invade Japan first, leading to a divided communist North Japan and a democratic South Japan, much like Korea. Or Option C, the U.S. would simply delay the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki until 1946, extending the war but achieving the same historical result. Drop your choice and your tactical reasoning in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and stay locked in for our next deep dive into the brutal realities of military history.